change that. All righty, welcome everyone. And we are looking at the story of Herod and how he responded when the wise men did not return to him. And I got thinking about this the other day. This is a lectionary reading for Sunday, but I'm not sure why, because because the wise men don't come until Epiphany, which is January 6th. Right. And this takes place after the wise men. Yeah. So, but I didn't put the lectionary together. So anyways, why don't we begin with the word of prayer? God of all that is holy and all that is human, we give you thanks for calling us once again to gather and to ponder the sacred words of long ago. We come with great anticipation, knowing that you will bless us with wisdom and the courage and the determination that we need for the living of these days. And for this, we give you thanks in the name of your Son, who came to dwell among us full of grace and truth. Amen. All righty, so without further ado, let's go and listen to the reading.
Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene.
All righty. Questions, comments, and conundrums. I do have one conundrum, but I'll defer that for a moment.
This is being powerfully driven by God with directions to everybody. He's directing this.
Yep, we have a very involved God here. He tells the wise men not to go back to Herod. He tells Joseph in a dream to go to Egypt. So there are obvious signs of a very hands-on God, which then raises the question, well, if it's God's involved, why doesn't he get involved to the point where he strikes Herod down so he can't kill all the children in Bethlehem?
I've never known directly in any of the biblical parts God doing that.
Okay.
Not directly.
Not directly. All right.
But they don't go against his very, in the commandments, that would go against his own commandments.
Okay, so it's interesting now that you mention it, because God is involved, but God doesn't force the wise men to go home by a different way. He warns them not to go back to Herod. He warns Joseph to take Mary and the child and flee to Egypt. So God is involved, but God isn't dictating exactly what's going to happen. It's sort of like there's a fork in the road, and God saying, if I were you, I'd go this way.
When putting a show together, the director directs the actors, but the actors actually do it.
Right.
And I think that's the description.
Exactly.
My impression on it.
Yep. So thankfully, the wise men returned by their other way, and thankfully, Joseph listens to what he's supposed to do, and he goes back to Egypt, or goes to Egypt.
I was just thinking as you were talking that, like in the Old Testament, there's a lot of, like God smiting,
yeah.
and stuff like that. And with the birth of Jesus, the focus turns more to like the kingdom of God, and whatever. And this almost seems like when the needle's flipping, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like a few hundred years prior, maybe he would have, just sent somebody to smite Herod. But now that Jesus has entered the world, it seems like it's more, I'm not gonna smite that guy, but I'm gonna help you, like get around him, or whatever you want to call it. So you'll still be able to live your best life, so to speak, in modern terms, but without like the righteous killing.
So this is actually a question that I get asked from time to time, and people will say, there seems to be a very different God in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures from the God that we see in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and in the life of Jesus. And so does that mean that God changed? And if God changed, well, if God is perfect, God shouldn't have to change. So my answer is to say, did God change, or did our understanding of God change? And I think that's the case, is that with Jesus, we have a firsthand glimpse of God, so to speak. And so people's understanding of the nature of God changed, over time. And that comes to its fulfillment in the birth of Christ. Yes, Don?
That evolution of our perception of God, I think, is continuing to go on. I think it is always going on. And I think that's something we tend to forget. And I think the big danger is our interpretation of what we understand God. Is it the human or God's interpretation that we're living by? In other words, are we fading away from what we should be following, or by being man and saying, well, our perception is this, so it must be our way? Or are we actually following God's way?
So I think that it's tricky, because if you open the door to the possibility that we're growing in our understanding, it's possible that our prejudices, our desires shade who we want God to be, and God didn't, we don't create God, God creates us. And as an example, the Imago Dei, we are created in the image of God. What does that mean? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? And we get ourselves into trouble a lot because we start with ourselves and we say, well, I've got two hands, so must mean God has two hands, or I can think rationally, so it must have something to do with that. When the reality was, if you want to know what it means to be created in the image of God, you have to start with God and then work back toward us. And when I do that, I start with the definition in 1 John, God is love. And so we have a certain capacity for love, and that's what it means to be created in the image of God. But it's a very special kind of love, right? And it has to be something that is unique to us as human beings, because nothing else in creation is said to be created in the image of God. So what I say is that if we look at Jesus, we see particularly in his sacrifice on the cross, agape love, the highest form of love. It's the sacrificing of oneself. And I always say that there's an agape with a capital A and an agape with small a's, okay? So a parent working a second job so a child can go to college, that's agape love with a small a, even though it is a great sacrifice. Agape with a capital A, obviously Jesus on the cross, but also some of the things that we witnessed on 9/11, where first responders were running into the building, risking their lives, and in many cases they lost their lives. And so that's what I say it means to be created in the image of God, is we have this capacity for agape love. And what will often happen is somebody will say, well, what about a dog who protects his master? All right. And I do have an answer for that. Okay. Question, is the dog doing it out of a conscious decision, or is it instinct? If it's instinct, if it's a reflex, then
But you hear lots of stories, not to get off onto the animal.
Yeah.
You do hear lots of stories of somebody being deathly ill.
Mm-hmm.
And in bed, and really, and the dog will go up and curl up with them.
Mm-hmm.
These stories.
Yep. Right.
Is that, it's compassion.
It's compassion, but the dog isn't making a sacrifice there.
Oh, no.
Dog isn't making a sacrifice, and in a certain sense, it's a little bit of cat love.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I define cat love this way: if you're opening a can of tuna, the cat caresses your leg.
Right.
Okay, it's not showing you affection. It's or even if it just is caressing your leg, the cat isn't caressing you; it's caressing itself. And his
guest preacher sometime years and years ago.
Uh-huh.
And his sermon was about like you should be the dog and not the cat.
Yep.
When it comes to Jesus, like the dog love, like woo!
Yeah, exactly. Dog love versus cat love. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And here's the other reason why I would say that it isn't agape love when a dog sacrifices itself. And let's say somebody's pointing a gun and the dog attacks and gets shot and killed. Okay. As I say, it's a reflex, it's instinct. And secondly, in order for it to be agape in the sense of, getting shot and dog dying, you have to have a conscious understanding of the reality and the permanency of death. And I don't think a dog has that. I mean, a dog knows what pain is and whatnot. But so anyways, this is, again, we start with God and project onto, use God to define us rather than the other way around. And that's why I always like the name that God gives Moses at the burning bush. When Moses says, hey, you want me to go to Pharaoh, the most powerful man on the planet, and tell him to let the people go, and you want me to tell that to the Israelites, and they're all going to ask me, who sent you? In other words, what's your name? And God responds by saying, I am who I am. Or some translations say, I will be who I will be. Okay. And it's almost as if saying, no, Moses, I am who I am. I'm not going to let you put labels on me, because every time you put a label on me, it defines me, it limits me, like father or judge or creator. And I'm all of those things and more. So I am who I am. Now, as I said in the email that went out, I find myself thinking about Herod here. And Herod wasn't nice. He was a couple of my favorite Herod stories that I am familiar with. He had 3 of his sons killed because he saw them as a threat to his throne. And so there was a saying in Jerusalem that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be his son. And then the other thing is that when Herod was about to die, he left instructions that when he died, that soldiers were to round up some important people in Jerusalem and kill them, because he was bound and determined that when he died, there would be some tears shed in Jerusalem. So he was not a nice guy. And so I guess the thing that's been going through my mind is, I think we can all think of someone we have to deal with either once in a while or maybe more frequently, who's just not a nice person, who's difficult, okay? And how do we deal with difficult people?
Stay away from them.
Stay away from them?
This kind of says, just stay away.
Okay. So it's interesting that you say that, because that's what Joseph has to do. He has to stay away from them. Is that fair?
No, it doesn't mean dead.
Is it?
Yeah, I was gonna say.
What's the alternative? But what about us? I mean, in our
Well, this is it's different between just like somebody that's mean. Here was evil. Let's face it, he was evil.
he was evil,
He was
absolutely.
evil, and I think
We're talking about
if somebody's,
degrees.
like, truly evil.
Okay.
People like us should just stay away.
Right.
Like, unless you have to.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. I realize in some respects we're comparing apples and oranges, because the mean people that we might have to deal with are nowhere near Herod.
The story of the prodigal son is not a meanness here, but it is how you deal with people when there is separation or disagreement in ideas.
Yeah.
It's interesting how the prodigal son is written. In dealing with somebody who leaves you or is a threat to you or is a danger, and they go away, you, in dealing with them, as long as they are that way, you stay where you are. If they change and come to you, then you accept them. So that's a mechanism of handling
Okay. So
alienation, people who are mean, people who go away from you, people who don't want you or anything else. How do you deal inside yourself as you wait until they change?
so you don't close. You may avoid them, but you don't close the door and lock it forever.
No.
You always leave it open just a little bit.
Well, most people that are truly mean have a reason.
Have a reason.
There's the reason in there. We may not know what that reason is, but it could be any form of abuse that they suffered.
Look at the Grinch.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So people who are mean, there's usually a reason why.
Yeah, usually.
Yeah. And, as you were saying that, Nancy, it reminded me of one of my all-time favorite illustrations. And I think it was actually one of the Chicken Soup for the Soul books. And this is back, before you had caller ID and all of that, and or cell phones. So this guy, he dials a number, and the person on the other end of the line, when he answers, says wrong number and hangs up. And the guy who placed the call said, well, how does he know that it's a wrong number? I haven't even said who I am or anything. And he calls, the guy hangs up again, says wrong number, hangs up. And so the third time he calls, and he says, before you hang up, how do you know it's a wrong number when you don't even know who it is yet that's calling you? And the guy says, you figure it out, and slams the phone down. So the guy calls back again, and he's the mean, cranky old guy says, you figure it out? And he says, the guy who calls says, well, the only thing I can think of is that nobody ever calls you. He says, you got it, and hangs up again. So the guy calls back again, and the old guy says, what do you want now? And the guy who calls said, well, I just figure if nobody ever calls you that maybe I should. And so that opened the door a little bit, and finds out that the guy is all alone, has had all this misfortune in his life. And but he also finds out that the guy worked at one time, this is in New York City, I believe, worked for, I forget whether it was a fireman or a policeman, I think fireman. And the guy who called also worked for a fire department in New York. And so, they develop a friendship. The old guy eventually, passes away. But again, and maybe this is why Jesus said, turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek, because when you do that, you're keeping that door open. I mean, in a sense, that's what this guy did with the phone call. He kept turning the other cheek. Now, in some situations, depending on how mean the person is, you can turn the other cheek, but Jesus didn't say anything about not taking a step back so you're out of swinging range, so to speak. And I think that's, the reality. And I guess my question is, the situation, the example that I gave, or in general, how often does a mean person change?
If something has to motivate them to change, why would they change otherwise?
So
What
would we
would change at all?
So would we be the instrument of change?
I don't know.
What's your question?
If a mean person is going to change, do we have a role to play in that?
Yeah.
We do?
Yes, you do. Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes, because we can promote change through showing kindness and interest.
Okay.
And of course, that is what makes one of the greatest Christmas stories so wonderful, is the story of The Christmas Carol, which is about change and redemption.
Oh, about Scrooge,
Yeah,
change and redemption.
Yes, here you have a person with a personality of a porcupine changing.
Yeah.
And redemption, but it is through the work of others who are constantly encouraging him or showing him light.
It's
darkness.
If you look at so many Christmas movies and specials, there is that underlying theme. Scrooge, the Grinch, even Rudolph. Horrible theology, by the way. Horrible theology. The only way he can be accepted is by showing that he has some value to them. He can save the day for them. But at the end, everybody realizes that they have been unfair to both Rudolph and the little elf there, Hermie. Okay, so there's that one. It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah. Although, interestingly enough,
Except that guy never gets nice.
Mr. Potter,
Yeah. In fact, he never gets his just reward, so to speak.
he does not.
He steals the $8,000, but he never gets punished for it.
Yeah. I actually read an article within the last couple of weeks about It's a Wonderful Life. And do you know that the FBI saw it as a subversive movie in one sense? Because it put bankers in a bad light.
Well, that was during the Hoover era.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then the article pointed out that, this FBI memo mentions nothing about Mr. Potter stealing the $8,000 and never giving it back. What's the old saying? Give a man a gun, he can rob a bank. Give a man a bank, and he can rob the world. There's some truth to that. So
we have a case going on right now on this crypto coin thing.
the FTX, the cryptocurrency.
Defrauded many people.
Yeah, I mean, $2 billion, and he's originally from Needham and Newton.
Oh, really?
Yeah, originally from Needham. No,
Creative people.
take it back. It might be Swampscott or something, but he's definitely originally from this area. And what's really kind of show you how it's just unfair. So he posts a $250 million bond so he can stay out of jail. It's $250 million he stole.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it in Bitcoins?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. And then on top of it, you read that they're now investigating after the day that the company declared bankruptcy. Somebody stole like $176 million from the company.
And it wasn't the head of the company.
They don't know yet. They don't know this. The question is, did somebody hack in and steal the money, or was it an inside job? But
Sounds like Ocean's 11.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
oh my gosh, I'd forgotten about Ocean's 11, that movie. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, Don.
Going back to your example of the old man, the two firemen, if you will.
Yeah, the two firemen. Yep.
The example I use of waiting for somebody to reach out, that the mistake of the call to him, if the caller called not knowing who he was calling in the first place on it,
Mhm.
so he was on the wrong call to begin with. The point that I'm trying to make is the older man picked up the phone and he kept picking up. He didn't have to. He never had.
Oh,
to answer
interesting.
that phone.
So
So he was reaching out.
the two firemen, he keeps calling, so you give him credit. But the old man,
He answered it.
he could have just let it ring and ring and
You
ring.
got it. Yeah.
Interesting.
So he was reaching out, and it goes along with the prodigal. You still have to wait until they reach out.
So does that mean,
Yeah, until they're ready.
so that maybe that's another part of dealing with mean people, that even mean people, they have some good in them. And if you look, you can find that good. And this man, elderly man, there was a part of him that must have wanted to make a connection because he kept picking up the phone. And so, in doing that, he's opening the door a little bit. And, and I would make the argument that even in Herod, there was some good. It may be a stretch, but, big stretch. But there's one thing about Herod that I think we have to give him credit for. Herod was threatened by this child, okay? Now, how could Herod be threatened by a little newborn baby?
Because of what they said the baby was.
What's that?
Because of what they said the baby was. A king of all
Was-
the world, a greater king than him.
Was
Greater power.
the king of the Jews, and Herod was the king of the Jews.
Was Herod Jewish or Roman?
I believe he was Roman. Yep. See, this is the way I look at it. Herod was the only one who realized that this baby was going to grow up and rock the boat, both his and everyone else's. Everybody else was saying, oh, the cute little baby, and, way in the manger and all of that. They didn't have that song back then, but everybody else is focusing on this little tiny child. And Herod realizes that eventually this child is going to make life challenging for everyone.
Understood.
And that's because-
Yeah, he understood the prophecy better than the Jews themselves. Yep.
Well, I think we believe part.
Yeah, he did.
But that could be intelligent, it's not good.
Pardon me?
That could be intelligent, it's not good. But when you're intelligent, I mean, you're good.
Yeah, but he connected the dots, and so I give him credit for that. Anybody could have connected the dots, but he's the only one who did. He's the only one who did. So, I see all these aspects of dealing with mean people. Sometimes you have to put some distance between you and them. One of the sermon illustrations that every once in a while someone will mention to me is, I forget who wrote it, but used an image of a theater. And the first thing the person wrote is, not everyone so each person's life is their own theater. And the writer said, not everyone in your theater deserves to sit in the front row. Some people need to be asked to sit in the balcony. And I thought, that's a good illustration. And some people need to be asked to leave the theater. But again, like you said, Don, you don't lock the door completely. You always have to leave it open. And you don't ban them for life. No, you don't ban them for life. So yeah, sometimes you have to put some distance between yourself and a quote unquote mean person. Other times you look for the good in them, and you don't give up on them. You don't stop loving them, as you said, Tom. Yep.
Well, you can always pray for me.
And you can pray for them.
One time on the bicycle trail, some older gentleman said, I wouldn't necessarily say somebody said it was me, but he was really cranky.
Yeah.
Me going fast. I rang my bell, apparently. That didn't help him to know I was there, but he said something really cranky, and I was just like, part of me wanted to stop and say something to him, but I was just like, he's got to be an unhappy person if he's that cranky.
Yeah.
His dog. So I just said,
Yep.
whatever.
Just say, pray. Yep.
I will say that to you.
Yes, Don.
So the essence that we come down to is where you start in the beginning, the definition of God, and we use the phrasing, now faith, hope, and love abide, but the greatest of these is love.
Yeah.
But I have to say the other two are the way to love.
Okay. So what you're saying is that in order to love the mean person, you have to have faith in God and in yourself and in the other person, and hope that the person can change. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I had that happen with when my mother was so unwell, and I was seeing a therapist. And one of the people in my therapy group had the personality of a porcupine. It just and I tried to not give up on that person, and he would used to call me up, and then would become argumentative. And he was in a way reaching out for help, and I still wouldn't give up on them. And he over the years he changed, and he became a very good friend.
Yeah.
And then in a time of need when I needed some help, he stepped right up to the plate and did some things.
Oh, interesting. So there was a thawing, or a less prickliness as yeah. And one of the things that I've learned, this has happened a couple of times over the years, is instead of saying to myself, oh, that person's mean, I'll ask, I wonder why that person is mean. And then there's a further step. And I've had to, in some situations, go to a person and say to them, in fact, this happened just last year, and say, have I done something to offend you, to make you angry at me? And in the situation I'm thinking about last year, yes, I did. Unintentionally, but I did. And when you come right down to it, it doesn't matter if I did it intentionally or unintentionally. The effect on the person was the same. Okay. And so this person who was being mean to me had a reason for being mean to me. Okay. Should this person have been proactive and said, hey, I'm really upset because you did X, Y, or Z? Probably. Okay, absolutely. But the person didn't. And so I found myself in a situation, how am I going to handle this? And I went to the person and I said, did I do something to offend you? And then I get a very nasty, one of the nastiest emails I've ever gotten in my life. And I thought, okay, am I going to respond to this person's anger? with anger, or so I wrote an email and I said, I'm sorry, I understand why you're angry at me now. And if I had to do over, I would have done X, Y, Z differently. And never heard back from that person. Never heard back from that person. I've seen that person on a couple of occasions, but it is what it is. That's. So I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes you have to start by looking at yourself and say, okay, here's interesting too. The wise men went home by another way. Okay. Now, they would have been entirely justified if, when they get the message that, their way of dealing with Herod is, to go home another way. They would have been entirely justified when they got told by God to go home by another way, say, no, Lord, that's not fair. We don't need to change. He's the one that needs to change. You change him. And, we rode all this way and now we got to go back. And I mean, you think about it, when they came to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, they would have used probably the easiest route. Well, if they're going home by another way and they're trying to avoid Herod, it's going to be off the beaten path. It's probably going to be longer. It's going to be more difficult. And they're aware of that. So, don't ask us to change, Lord. You change him. But sometimes that's what you have to do with a mean person, is you have to change, like it or not. Like it or not.
This part goes along with the part of avoiding, like the prodigal again. We would want the person to change, and if God is the intermediary that you're referring to in this case, we still have to deal with God dealing with us. God dealing with other people is his dealing with them.
Right.
And we should not try to manipulate God.
Right. So we don't dictate to God, you change that person. All we can do is ask God to help us change. Help me change so that I can deal with this person better than I currently am.
And help you change to deal with the unfairness. You're being unfairly asked to do something that you don't want to do.
Right.
So I need help in understanding that unfairness and work with it.
Okay. Yep. So if you have to change, you need the patience and the determination to make the changes that ordinarily you shouldn't have to make.
Right.
Yep. To deal with
that
it.
all the time in our lives.
Sure.
But the other,
We may do more work for a group than we should because everybody else isn't doing their job.
Right.
But if you want to get it done, sometimes you have to do it even though it's unfair.
Okay. Yep.
and in dealing with it, in dealing with God, the phrase that we all use is not my will, but thy will be done. In other words, yeah, we're very directive at times because we have things we want and that we will. But the contrite way, I suppose, in dealing with God, who is the greatest of everything, is not my will, but thy will be done. And we do get those little messages in our head saying, oh, this is what I want. And sometimes those little messages may be ours, and sometimes they may be God's, and I think that's where our confusion comes.
Yeah. Yep. I get another little question in the few minutes we have left. How did Joseph get to Egypt?
Oh, that's in the verse that was left out on 38.
Oh, what is it?
And the angel of the Lord say, take those gifts of the ones who gave you, put them on eBay.
Nice.
Yeah.
Just don't take Southwest Airlines.
And this is one of the things that I love about this story is it just shows us God is always 2-3 steps ahead of us. Okay. Here's Joseph. We know he hasn't got any money. If he had any money at all, someone in Bethlehem would have given him a place to spend the night. Okay. But didn't have any money. So if he didn't have any money for a place for the night, how does he have the money to make the long trip through the Sinai desert to Egypt? Okay. You need transportation, probably an animal or something. And there's no record that they came to Bethlehem with a donkey.
What about the cross on the back of donkeys and that is enough?
A what?
What about the cross on the back of donkeys? Isn't that evidence enough? Do you know there's a cross on the back of a donkey?
No.
There's a little donkey's gonna be like a grayish color, and there's a cross. They have like.
Oh, really?
Running down their spine.
Oh, that's interesting. I never knew that. So there's actually, in the fur of a donkey, it's a cross. Oh, okay. Well, oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. But no, it just says that Mary and Joseph went from Nazareth to Bethlehem. It mentions nothing about how they got there.
Because they probably needed money to get a camel and some camping outfit, and they probably had to pay a fee to join a caravan.
Yep.
And need money.
So the reality is that they had no means to get to Egypt, but the wise men brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, all very expensive gifts. And so Joseph would undoubtedly have been able to use those gifts to get the provisions and the animal, whatever that they needed to get to Egypt.
Have you ever thought, do you think this was a test by God when he told Joseph what he had to do? Because he had no fees, no money. He had to depend on somebody, the innkeeper, to allow him to have a place.
Yeah.
He had, maybe it was a test for him of, well, what if Joseph said, well, no, I don't want to do that.
There's says you can take it back another step. Mary could have said no.
Right.
You know, you're gonna have a child, and the Holy Spirit's gonna come upon you, and she could have said, oh, find yourself another virgin.
Right.
You know, and again, it's back to the free will. And look, we have free will to deal with people however we want. Okay, but as people of faith, and this story gives us some inkling, some clues as to how we can do that. But
You say often that you say that it might have been like a couple of years
Oh.
at least between when he was born and the wise man
Yes.
came, and then after the wise man came, he fled.
Mhm.
So also Joseph, I'm not saying he didn't sell the frankincense and stuff, but he could have been working. I mean, he was a carpenter.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So he might have found employment in Bethlehem because it was later.
Like 2 years worth of wages.
Yeah. It's suggested that it was up to 2 years later, and the reason why they say that the wise men got there up to 2 years later, is we know that when they got there, they went into a house. They found the baby's no longer in the manger, is in a house. And there's no indication of how old the child was when the wise men got there. The other reason why they say it's up to 2 years is because Herod orders all the male children 2 years and younger. So that's given as a indication that it could have been up to 2 years later, but we don't know how long it is. But your point is, if they have been there for a while, he's certainly going to have to find some sort of employment to keep them fed, so to speak. So, yeah. So,
By the way, today is a special day, the 28th of December, on the liturgical calendar is the
Yes.
Feast of the Holy Innocents.
the what?
Feast of the Holy Innocents.
It's the Feast of the Holy Innocents?
Yes.
That counts me out.
No, that's so that's referring to the well. See, I've always called this the slaughter of the innocents,
Right,
but the
slaughter.
Feast of the Holy Innocents. I didn't know that was a liturgical day.
That's the Boxing Day, the day after Christmas is St. Stephen's Day.
Yeah.
I think then Tuesday is St. John's,
Uh-huh.
The evangelist, and today is the Feast of the Slaughter of the Holy Innocents.
Yep.
Here I thought it was just the fourth day of Christmas.
Oh my goodness. And by the way, Matthew is wrong in one thing he says.
Typo?
Nope. So Matthew uses more quotes from the Old Testament than any of the other gospel writers, because we know that Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. And so he wanted to prove to the Jewish audience that Jesus was the Messiah. What better way to do that than use their scriptures? It's the very last verse. And he went and lived, he being Joseph, and Joseph went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. That's not what a Nazarene is.
Is it a Jewish person?
It's a person. Well, Jesus could be a Nazarene, but Matthew is using it in the sense that Jesus came from Nazareth. Okay, that's not this quote. A Nazarene was a holy person who was dedicated to God, was not supposed to cut their hair and have no strong drink.
Oh.
That was what a Nazarene was. Okay.
What was the last thing you said about her and what?
And no strong drink.
Oh, okay.
Well, we know that Jesus drank because he had wine. What's that? Yeah. There's a famous, you all know a famous Nazarene in the Hebrew scriptures. Okay, remember what I said? Couldn't cut their hair. Samson was the Nazarene. Yeah, Samson was a Nazarene. So,
So did the Nazarene, that thing, have anything to do with Nazarene?
I don't know if there's a connection between Nazarene and someone from Nazareth, if that's where the word came from. But
Obviously this is translated into English,
mhm.
and it's very just like
Yep.
an American.
Yep.
You
I
know?
will do some further research, but if you were from Nazareth, I believe you would have been called a Nazarite. Yep. Yep. All righty, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today, Nancy.
Would you consider this strong drink?
Yes, but remember now,
I heard
Sam